Welcome back to Life's Chillent. My name is Avital, and in just a couple of days, the Jewish holiday of Passover begins. And Passover is a beautiful commemoration, a celebration of the Jewish people's liberation from slavery in Egypt. Back in the times of the Torah, the Jewish people were enslaved by the Egyptians for 210 years. And at the end of those 210 years, God, through a series of incredible miracles, frees the Jewish people from slavery. And every single year since then, we celebrate the holiday of Passover. And on the first night of Passover around the world, and on the second night everywhere outside of Israel, we hold a Seder, which is sort of a symbolic festive meal. And it's our task every year to feel as though we, on that night of the Seder, are also leaving the land of Egypt and going from slavery to freedom. So we try hard to sort of go back in time and feel the emotions and the excitement and the anticipation of leaving slavery into freedom. And throughout the Seder, there are different components that are supposed to help us get into that mindset. We have the retelling of the story, we have songs of praise to God, and we have symbolic foods that are on the Seder plate, this plate that we put in the middle of our table with these different symbolic elements. So there are 6 foods that end up on the Seder plate. We have first the karpas, which is usually parsley, but a green vegetable. And we take the karpas and we dip it in salt water. And the salt water is supposed to represent the tears that the Jewish people cried from the bitterment of their slavery, from the sadness and the sorrow and the difficulties that they were going through. We have the charoset, which is sort of a fruity paste, which is supposed to represent the mortar that the Jewish people used in building bricks and buildings and structures for Pharaoh. We have the maror and the chazeret, which are bitter herbs, which are supposed to remind us of the bitterness of slavery. We have the zeroah, which is the shank bone, which is supposed to remind us of the offering that we would bring in Passover, the paschal lamb that we would bring when we had the temple. And lastly, we have the beitza, which is the egg, and it symbolizes an offering that Jewish people would bring on holidays, but it also symbolizes the life cycle and sort of the hopes for the future when things are difficult. And so every single year, rabbis, teachers, parents, and individuals are tasked with how do we make the concept of going from slavery to freedom relevant? Because it's hard. We live in a generation where that's not something we've faced very often. And usually we go through topics of, personal freedom, of I'm going to sort of remove the shackles of my own burdens from me. And that is a very worthy thing to think about during Passover. But this year is different for the Jewish people. This year, I don't think it's such a far stretch to imagine slavery and the joy that comes with freedom. Because since October 7th, the Jewish people have been experiencing something that is new in this generation. Generations of the past have also experienced such intense persecution and difficulty. Think about the Holocaust, pogroms, Jewish people being expelled from other nations. But in this generation, in this day and age, this is something new for the Jewish people. And since October 7th, there have been incredibly high levels of anti-Semitism. There's been a lot of loss of loved ones and family members and friends, and everybody knows someone who lost someone important to them. Everybody knows someone who was killed, who was murdered. And at the top of all of this, we still have 129 hostages in Gaza. 34, these are estimates, but at least 34 bodies that are being held in Gaza. That is a slavery. That is a slavery we are experiencing as Jewish people. We are watching our family in the greater Jewish family. We are watching them experiencing slavery this year. And so to try to picture the joy that would come with freedom is not that far-fetched, because we are experiencing such intense emotions and difficulty and pain, and we have cried those tears like our ancestors cried from the bitterment of their circumstances. That is ever present today. And it's very hard to say, how can we celebrate Passover in a time like this? How can we celebrate our freedom in the past when in the present there is There are hostages in Gaza, and there are people suffering, and there are families who won't have complete tables this year. How can we celebrate that? And I can't say that I have an answer for it, but there is something in those symbolic foods that I mentioned that I think can give us a glimpse of hope and comfort when it comes to the future. So first, the karpas that I mentioned, the bitter herbs that we dip into the salt water to represent the tears of our ancestors, that same parsley, it's usually parsley, that parsley is also a sign of spring and vitality and growth. Passover is the holiday of the springtime. It's the holiday that falls when trees are starting to bloom and fruits and vegetables are starting to grow again, where the earth has sort of, the snow has melted in whatever part of the world you live in, but things are starting to have signs of life again, and that's a sign of hope for the future. We have the charoset, which I mentioned, the fruity paste. But while the charoset does represent the difficulty that the Jewish people had in making all of these different buildings for Pharaoh and the hardships of their physical labor, the fruits are also a representation of fertility and of new generations and new birth, and the hope that it will be prosperous and that the Jewish nation will grow in numbers. And so that's really beautiful. And then we have the egg, which I mentioned, which represents the cycle of life. There's loss, and there's suffering, and there's death, but there's also birth, and there's new marriages, and there's new hope for the future. And so in that cycle of life, we have the difficulties, but we also have this glimmer of hope for the good that's just around the corner on this egg. So while this year we enter the holiday of Passover with heavy hearts, and perhaps not as able to come to that mindset of celebrating Passover and our liberation, I think that we can find hope in the Passover story that God has freed the Jewish people countless times before, and that this time will be no different. That currently we are in this period of suffering where we're waiting for all of the Jews to return home to their families, to be together again. And we're in this sort of limbo period where we are just having to endure some very difficult realities. But just as God has taken us out of Egypt and He's taken us out of all of these terrible situations before, we know that He'll do it again. All of the suffering the Jewish people have endured is just a reminder of our strength and our resilience and our ability to continue on even when times are hard. And so, just as God has done beautiful miracles for the Jewish people in the past, may God this year bring a miracle about and have all of the hostages freed and return home to their families, so that we can experience the joy, not only the slavery that we have experienced, but can we experience the joy of watching them be freed and watching them be liberated and return home to their families, so that we can understand the full scope of this Passover story.